Hi there. Hello, everybody. Ciao. It would be good if you opened up your screens and showed me your face. I'd like, actually, it would be nice if, and this is entirely voluntary, could send me an email basically explaining who you are, what year in university you're in, what your academic interests are, um, and maybe some remarks as to why you enrolled in this class, um, in order for us to have some idea of, for me to have some idea of where you're coming from. Um, so this is the history of the Vietnam War, 300 level course. I assume that everybody is enrolled and we're able to get access to the syllabus. Is there anybody who is not does not have access to the syllabus? So I presume that you have access. And of course, if you have any other questions about the details, you could include that in the email. Well, I guess I'll start off. Well, I'll note the fact that today I had a communication from a guy from Bermuda. It was this guy lives in Bermuda, and so he suddenly emailed me because he's writing his memoirs. And this guy is the former head of a private school in Winnipeg called St. John's Ravenscourt. Does anybody know of this school, St. John's Ravenscourt? Can anybody explain what this place is? What is it? St. James. He was the head of it for some years. Anybody? Well, it's the leading private school in Winnipeg for boys. You have to have a lot of money to go to St. John's Ravenscourt. And Steve Johnson was the head of it. Steve Johnson was very, I had a lovely personality. He was very pleasant, but he happened to be a draft dodger who came up to Canada when he was drafted by the United States during the Vietnam War. And he's writing his memoirs. So he spent, he got a PhD from our history department, and I was one of his teachers. So he wants to sort of include his years as a student at the University of Manitoba in the memoir. Steve left the United States, became a fugitive because he refused to fight in the Vietnam War. But then when he came up here, he was entirely respectable. He got a PhD, and ultimately he found a job at St. John's Ravenscourt and had a very good career in these very posh private schools. And he ends up retired in Bermuda. And to retire to Bermuda, you have to have some considerable means. And so I would say that his life worked out. But the reason I cite this is because something like 40,000 Americans, young men, often accompanied by young women, fled the United States during the Vietnam War, mainly because they refused to fight in the war, or they were deserting from the army. And so it suggests that within the United States, the war, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, especially amongst young people, about this war. And in fact, the United States fell into a huge tumult during this war, which we'll be dealing with. There was a huge sort of internal um, um, upheaval, largely based in the universities, but also in the main cities. And it certainly, the war in Vietnam was central, but there were also other issues, the civil rights issue in the United States, and there was also the whole issue of the nature of the university itself. The students who were involved in this, and there were millions of them, questioned the whole nature of the university as a political and academic institution. So this was a source of great upheaval, and certainly Canada was involved in this, as I will explain. Now, that's what I'm saying as an introduction. Are there any questions about what I've just said? No questions. Okay. Now, there is a syllabus, and I'm going to deal with this syllabus seriously next time we meet, that is to say, on Friday. We'll go over the whole syllabus, and you'll come to understand exactly what is required of you. And of course, if there's any question at all about anything, you just email me, and I'll get back to you more or less immediately and try to explain things. So we're going to deal with the syllabus next time. What I want to do today is basically give you an overview, what we call sort of geopolitical this framework for understanding the history of the Vietnam War. So I'm going to be lecturing, and maybe we can have a little discussion as we go along. I would like to have a lot of discussion, and it's really up to you whether you're going to. We're going to have this class can be a straight lecture class, but hopefully it can be also. It might turn into a kind of seminar-like class. There could be a lot of class discussion, because we're at the third year level now in university, and as you go along, it's no longer a question of simply the professor lecturing at you. There's also the possibility of a participation. So I hope there will be a lot of that. So let me start by asking you a question. Now, the Vietnam War, it happened, I guess, 50 years ago, more or less, maybe a little less. It ended in 1975. Because it's a little 42 years ago, 41 years ago. The question is it relevant today? And so, for example, I guess it was last week, more or less, we see that events happened in Afghanistan. What happened in Afghanistan is what I'm asking. And can you see any connection between what happened in Afghanistan and what happened in Vietnam with respect to the United States? Anyone? Yes, Mr. Schur, please.
I really don't know much about it. I just know that the US recently pulled out, and a very large percentage of the land has been taken by Taliban forces. That's about the extent of my knowledge.
Well, you see the U.S. pulled out. There was an airlift. helicopters and so on. Well, that's more or less what happened in 1975. There was a kind of chaotic retreat from Vietnam, and we see a similar. It's not the same, obviously, because the adversary is completely different. The Taliban are back to the Middle Ages, whereas in Vietnam, it was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which won the war. And of course, it was and is a communist state. And of course, the communists claimed a kind of ultra modernity, whereas the Taliban want to go back to the past. But nevertheless, it does. What is interesting about it is the what I would call the limits of empire. That is, the United States, especially when it won the Cold War, when the Soviet Union went down, and I'm sure you all know that. The United States at that, in the aftermath of that, if you go back to that period, the 90s, and into the 2000s, they aspired to basically global dominance because there was no power opposing them. And this was explicitly said. But the result of the Afghan war reflects the fact that, in fact, the United States' ambition to basically control the world simply is not working out. The other, somehow connected to this, is another conflict which the United States is involved in. This has not yet resulted in armed conflicts, as far as we know. But there seems to be a new Cold War going on. And to what am I referring? What is the major, from the United States point of view, what is the major area of conflict between the United States and in the rest of the world? Does anybody have an idea? Mr. Shore, oh yes, Mr. Lavac, please.
I believe it's with China.
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit? Of course, you're right. Yes. What could you briefly tell us about it? It doesn't have to be an elaborated discussion, but just what's going on?
I don't really know much about the conflict, just that it's with China primarily is how that phrase has been thrown around.
Yes. Anybody else? Mr. Mathers.
Yeah, you can hear me, right? Just to make sure.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like with China, isn't it more, at least as of right now, it's like an economic and sphere political influence battle for the most part?
That's
Because
right.
there's not really, there's not really any like proxy wars between the two sides, but
Although they are,
yeah,
the United States is, and its allies, of which Canada is one, are, if you look, the U.S. Military assets, including its fleet, most of it is basically offshore China. So there is that, and we'll get into that. I would note as a parenthesis that, of course, Canada is now completely involved in the conflict with China, and you must have heard about. Does anybody know about the vice president of Huawei? What is that all about? Does anybody know that? Anything about that? Well, yes. Nolan,
Didn't we arrest someone from Huawei on behalf of the Americans?
Exactly. Kind of this person who was the vice president of Huawei was arrested by the Canadian authorities at the behest of the Americans, and she's been in jail over 2 years. And this is, well, the legal aspect of this, I have to say, is rather dubious, but it's clear that economic competition, Huawei, and the general growing economic influence of China is creating a lot of unease, especially with the Americans. And so we see its allies, including Canada, joining in this conflict, whether they want to be involved or not. They are. I would note that for the record that, as you'll see, Canada was able, because it had a special role in the Vietnam conflict, was able to avoid direct military conflict at the side of the Americans. Canada was able to stay out of the direct conflict. Unlike now, where Canada has been drawn in. So, what is with respect to the second aspect, this the China connection and so on? How is this related to the? I'm really trying to get at the fact that the Vietnam War is long in the past. It's 40 or more years ago. But the issue, the overall strategic issue is the same. What does the conflict with China today have to do with the Vietnam War yesterday? Does anybody have, can anybody suggest a connection? Well, it's all about the rising influence of China, which is not under the control of the United States, as you'll see. The how to deal with the rise of China. And of course, China is a big deal because China has 4 or 5 times the population of the United States. It has a highly educated and technically trained labor force. And most people expect it to become the dominant economic power in the world. We're seeing a huge shift in the distribution of economic and eventually, I guess, political power in the world. So the thing is that in another form, is what I'm trying to say, it's assumed a different form. The issue of the threat from China, because at the end of the day, and you'll see this clearly when I present a map, this rise of China what presented the United States with a real challenge. So now what I want to do is I want to get out a map. Can everybody see this map? I think you can. Can you see the map? Anybody? It should be on the screen now. Right. Now this is a map of the Pacific Ocean, as you see. And unfortunately, the map I'm using is the reason I'm using it is very clear. It shows the Pacific Ocean. Now, the thing is that although it's not shown in the map here, we'll be looking at Southeast Asia in a minute. But there's this, so there's this area in here to the north. I'm getting into a little of geography because it's important for you to sort of try to understand the basic geography of things. Now, up here, of course, is what was then the Soviet Union. And today is USSR, right up here in the north. You see here. And to the south of this, it's not fully shown, but this is, of course, China below it. And of course, at the time we're talking about, let's say where the timeline is 1950. We're looking at 1950. Well, these two states were both communist states. And they were allies. Here's the United States over here. And the distance between them, and here is Japan. Here is the Korean Peninsula. You see right here. There was a war going on at that time, and a little bit down here. I'll show it in a minute. Is Vietnam, and of course you see Australia, and New Zealand. You see Japan. You see the Philippine Islands, and then to the south, Indonesia. All of these, with the exception of Indonesia, were friends and allies of the United States. Well, there's the distance between Tokyo, Japan, and San Francisco is something like 12,000 miles. Is the distance. So here you have Vietnam. The United States is very far away. So what was the United States doing? Why was it interested in little Vietnam, way across the seas? Why did it evolve itself in Vietnam? Does anybody want to suggest why this was? Yes, Mr. McCallum, or Maxwell, I should say. Max,
Sure, that works.
what do you think?
I believe it was to combat the ideologies I believe like with the Red Scare and America's involvement in trying to curb communism, they were
Yes.
worried it was going to be an influence in Vietnam, and so they tried to stop it.
Yes, that's right. It was the essential reason that was given was the United States needed to defend itself and the rest of the free world against the threat of communism. And USSR and China were communists, these giant states. There was a struggle going on in Vietnam between the communists and the non-communists. Vietnam was right next to China, therefore the United States was very interested and fearful that Vietnam would fall to the communists. I'm playing it straight here. This is basically the framework of this. But what has to be remembered is that, well, the United States, because of its huge power, was able to project its power right across the Pacific Ocean, 12,000 miles. And it had all these friends, Japan, South Korea, the Philippine Islands, Australia, and New Zealand, who were in the American camp. So the American power was enormous. And so this is the overall context. Is there anything else that we might say about this at this point? Is there any question you have about these opening remarks? I'm trying to give you the sort of overall picture of trying to sort of give you the overall shape of things. So now I want to bring up another map. Here we are. So now this is good. This one will do. The only problem with it is it's a little small. So so here you can see clearly we talked about the China and China being communist, backed up by the Soviet Union ally, and to the south, basically we have Vietnam right here. You see how close it is to China. China is right up here. I believe Hong Kong is just about here or something. Here's the Philippine Islands. Here's Indonesia. There's Australia, a very strong ally of the United States, along with New Zealand. So this is Vietnam here, which you see in red. It's a sort of a narrow country along the coast. This sea is known as the South China Sea, and Vietnam, the coast of Vietnam abuts the South China Sea for the most part. But we should note for the record, and becomes important later, that for a long time, Vietnam and the neighboring state of Cambodia and another state in here in the interior, looks like a kind of palm tree here, this state, Laos, were all part of what was called Indochina. There are these three states that, as a matter of fact, the French had conquered, and they were organized as French Indochina. And so you have Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, because the war that we're talking about, that is to say, the American war, extended beyond the borders of Vietnam. The hinterland, the back area of this conflict, was Cambodia and Laos. The war spilled over into these two other states as well. Is there any question about what I've just been saying? Now, note that right here at the tip was the beginning of the island, the main island of Japan. We have to bear that in mind. So we have China, we have Japan, and to the north, we have the Soviet Union. And to recapitulate, the war was about containing the growing, what the Americans considered to be the growing threat of the extension of communism. It would take over, the American view was, unless it was contained, the communists would extend their power into Indochina. They would take over Vietnam, and they would, in fact, given that, they would extend their influence into the rest of Southeast Asia with its rubber, its tin, its oil. All of that could be taken over if communist influence was allowed to grow. And from a geostrategic point of view, I'm trying to explain, some of the issues which led to the American involvement. Are there any questions finally about this? I think this gives you some sense of the geography of this conflict. Now, I might say that I am going to, this lecture and all of the other lectures are going to be, are being recorded, and I will put them up on YouTube. In other words, the whole sequence of lectures will be available for your perusal, for your study on YouTube. So anything that you might miss or so on, you can just simply, they'll be, of course, in a sequence. You can just look them up on YouTube. So that's one of the ways I'm going to help you. But you'll see the syllabus gives a lot of support for your study. I'm giving you this lecture, but I am aware of your needs as a student, and you will be supported. Is what I'm trying to say in your studies and so I think all of you should do well. So let me now sort of get into somewhat more detail about what the lead up to the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War itself, when we talk about the Vietnam War, most people, especially in North America, they understand that to be the American War in Vietnam, where the dates of which were between 1965 and 1975. It was during those 10 years that the United States was more or less directly involved in the conflict. But the thing is that the war had a long prehistory. It had a long lead up. To understand the war, you have to understand the background. And in particular, you have to understand the French involvement in Indochina. And the fact is that the war against the communists, or the war against, we can call, to give it a name, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV, which was North Vietnam, the northern part of Vietnam, was under the control of the communists. This has a long prehistory, and in particular, the French, right after the Second World War, there was an anti-colonial revolt led by the communists against the French in Indochina, and in particular Vietnam. And before the American War, there was the French War between 1946 and 1953. Right after the war, 46 to 53, the French tried to keep control of Vietnam and Indochina against an anti-colonial revolt led by the communists. And it was their failure, that is to say, the French were defeated by 1953. The United States refused to accept this French defeat. And what happened is that basically the Americans replaced the French. And they tried to shore up an independent South Vietnam. And that fact gradually led to a full-scale war between the United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the communist state in the north, between 1965 and 75. Is there any question about that? And maybe it's not clear. Please intervene if you want a clarification. Okay. Now, all of this has to be understood in terms of world politics. So we have the French War between 1946 and 53. Then we have the American War, 65 to 75. All of it, of course, is in the context of the so-called Cold War between the communists and the so-called free world led by the United States. The Cold War between 1945 and 1989. The major event of the the end of World War II, what follows is the Cold War between communism and capitalism. And the war in Indochina, the French War and the American War, were all part of the Cold War, because we're looking at one theater, but the Cold War was being essentially fought out in Europe, in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. The war in Vietnam was just one aspect of this overall Cold War, and that has to be borne in mind. In fact, it was the climax of the Cold War. It was a hot war within the Cold War. And the American War was really the climactic event of the Cold War. Now, if we look at it in the large, of course, the war was going on in Vietnam. The United States was facing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the communist state in the north. But behind the scenes, the United States was also fighting. In the background was China and the Soviet Union, these two massive communist states on the one hand, and the United States and its allies on the other. That was the essential conflict, the overall conflict of the Cold War. And the Vietnam War was only one theater of this global conflict, is what I'm trying to say. And as we've already said, from the American point of view, the containment of communism was the main objective of its participation in the Cold War. However, having said all that and given due attention to the ideological dimension of this, we have to realize that when we talk about a prehistory, we have to understand that the United States, how did the United States come to be in Southeast Asia? How did this happen? How did it come to be in Asia is the question. Because, as I said, San Francisco is some 12,000 miles from Japan. So what was the United States doing in Southeast Asia, aside from this idea of containing communism? Well, as a matter of fact, the United States had become an Asian power since the beginning of the 20th century. The United States became involved in Asia. The United States, with its gigantic economic power and its naval power, projected itself into Asia at the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, it began earlier, but we can skip that. The first major event in which the United States became directly involved was a war against Spain for control of the Philippine Islands. Also, we note for control of Cuba and Puerto Rico. This is 1898, not even, we're not quite in the 20th century, but the Spanish-American War of 1898. The United States essentially took possession of Puerto Rico and Cuba and seized the Philippine Islands in 1898. Spain was defeated. The United States made the Philippines a colony. And that was really the beginning of a major American influence. Before that, the United States had been carrying increasingly active trade, especially with China, from the middle of the 19th century. But and the Americans took the Philippine Islands basically in order to convert it into a major military and naval base so that it could exercise continuing influence over Asia and indeed China. And of course, I would notice as an aside, a lot of other powers were interested in China, such a vast country, such a vast market, such a vast trading opportunities. So the United States was one of these countries. And so in 1898, they first became involved, and the United States involvement deepened. In fact, the United States became involved in 3 great wars in order to secure its position in Asia, to consolidate its position in Asia. The first of these wars I've already mentioned. the war, the Spanish-American War, the seizure of the Philippines. But then the United States became involved in a second war. That is to say, the Korean War. The Korean War, the dates of that, here's Korea here. You see Vietnam is down here, Korea up here. There was a conflict began in 1950, and it lasted between 1950 and 1953. There was basically a civil war in Korea between the communists and the non-communists. The Americans intervened, and they fought the communists to a draw. These two states, the capitalist state of South Korea and the North Korean state, they both continue to exist. But what is really important is that the Americans, in terms of justifying their involvement in the war, said, just as in Vietnam, we have to contain communism. Now, one thing I did forget, you'll forgive me, I made a mistake in the sequence. So there was a Spanish-American War, but what I left out was World War II in the Pacific, because the major rival, you'll have to insert this, the major rival of the United States in World War II in the Pacific and in Asia was Japan. And the United States and Japan were vying for control of Asia. Japan wanted to exclude the United States from Asia. So you have the Spanish-American War, then you have World War II. The Japanese are completely defeated. They become a vassal state, a completely subordinated state to the United States. They still are subordinated to the United States. Then the Korean War, and again to contain China, and then the war in Vietnam. So it's actually four wars in order to consolidate their control, their influence in the Pacific and in Asia. And so this sequence of wars basically explain, the wars were basically, in my view, economic wars. The basic idea was basically to make all of these states that we see floating in the sea, floating in the Pacific Ocean, are allied to the United States of America, so basically subordinated to the United States of America. And so, in the case of the Vietnam War, and now, China, so far as the United States is concerned, represents a threat to this American domination of Asia. And so this is the overall context for the Vietnam War, and it continues to be very important to today. Now, at the time the Americans fought the Vietnam War, they were at the peak of their power. The United States, when it went full force into Vietnam in 1965, the United States was absolutely at the peak. It had enormous industrial production and great economic prosperity. This is post-World War II, the 60s, which are remembered as this great cultural groovy period. Well, the United States was at its height as an economic power and as a political power in the world. So it went into Vietnam with great confidence that it we can stop communism in Vietnam, we can contain the communist threat in China. So that was the essential outlook that the Americans had. At the same time, of course, I would note that the war wasn't simply about all the things that I'm talking about. I've talked about the geostrategic and economic causes of the war, and I've talked a little bit about the ideological conflict. But the other great dimension of the war did not. We have to go back to the Spanish-American War, because in 1898, the Americans took over Cuba and Puerto Rico, Cuba in particular, as I'm hearing. And I would call Cuba, it was not quite a colony as Puerto Rico became, but it was what we call a semi-colony or protectorate of the United States. Right off the coast of Florida, this huge island, as big as England, with incredible sort of economic potential, became a protector of the United States. But then in 1959, a chap by the name of Castro made a revolution in Cuba, and the Americans lost control of Cuba. Worse, the success of Fidel Castro helped to fuel a colonial revolt all over the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in especially Latin America. People saw what was happening in Cuba, and they basically said, yes, we want to be independent of the United States, and we want to be independent of European colonial power. And so all over the world, this had already begun in the 1950s, a kind of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolt began in the Third World. And the Americans decided that the place to make a stand, the place where they were going to show that they could contain the spread, because lots of these revolts were inspired by Marxist or communist ideology, we're going to show that we can suppress and contain this revolt. So this revolt of the Third World is the other aspect of this. That is the essential background to the Vietnam War. I'm going to continue this, but we're going to begin next time with a full-scale analysis of the syllabus, making everything clear. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, Dustin.
Hi, I just had a question. So you said the 4 wars the US got involved in, it was the Spanish-American War, the Korean War.
The World War II.
Oh, World War II in itself, okay, yeah. And then the Pacific against Japan.
So the Spanish War, then the World War II, then the Korean War, it leads up to the Vietnam War.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody? Okay. So we're gonna go over the syllabus next time, and I'd like you to send me an email introducing yourself. This is not required, but it would be a good thing. I do feel that we were successful. We began to have a discussion, and that's pretty important. So the class began, I think, well. And let me say in conclusion that I'm going to give you maximum support in this class, and I hope we can have a kind of semi-seminar situation. Of course, I'm going to lecture, but at the same time, participation, talking in common, a back and forth, all of that is really important. So see you next time.